In Australia, it is clear that the Chinese Communist Party is working to covertly interfere with our media, our universities, and also influence our political processes and public debates.
Last year, in response to a scandal over Chinese Communist Party influence in Australia, the federal government passed sweeping new laws banning foreign interference in Australian politics.
We consider that the potential for foreign interference and foreign influence in our democratic system to be of such a high level of concern that it motivated us to totally redraft the laws so that we had the full suite of powers to police these real concerns.
Despite this, there's evidence that covert Chinese Communist Party interference is continuing. Why are people afraid?
Because of repercussions from the Chinese consulate or the Chinese government.
We've had multiple briefings at the top secret level from ASIO and other agencies that foreign interference is being conducted in Australia at an unprecedented level.
Tonight on Four Corners, new revelations about China's interference operations here in Australia and the efforts to influence our politicians.
Chinese New Year in Sydney South. It's an event as important to campaigning politicians as it is to many locals.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so proud to be here in Hurstville to bring in the Lunar New Year. And I can't think of a better way to kick off this year's celebrations than be here with thousands of people lining the streets, enjoying this wonderful celebration.
Around half the people living in this area have Chinese heritage. Among them is Marie Ma. Ma manages Chinese language newspaper, the Vision China Times, which sought to sponsor the New Year's event.
Being a sponsor for a council that has the largest Chinese population and the largest group of our readers actually lives within this council is actually very important to us, and for us to connect with our readers and or for us to reach, build that bridge between our local community and the Australian mainstream society.
Marie Ma says the Chinese government is seeking to control the news that Chinese Australians can read and listen to. What is the purpose of that control?
Well, I guess to control what people say about the government and how much the Chinese community know about the truth about issues and things that are going on.
Well, for the Chinese Communist Party, they're really keen on this sort of narrative control. The story of China is the story that they themselves want to define and want to tell. And anyone who sort of departs from the official version of China's story, that's not something that they want to hear. So other views are not welcome.
Marie Ma's paper refuses to take orders from Chinese government censors.
We are truly servicing the Chinese community here so they can actually get an understanding of what is really going on. There are some Chinese language media who try to be independent as well in the reporting, but there is always a red line that everyone's actually quite afraid of crossing.
Why are people afraid?
Because of repercussions from the Chinese consulate or the Chinese government.
Marie Ma's newspaper is read by Chinese Australians across the nation and publishes stories critical of the Chinese Communist Party. Because of this, it's been targeted again and again. Vision Times advertisers based in China have been visited by Chinese intelligence officers from the Ministry of State Security, warning them to pull their ads.
they were annoyed. Actually, they were very annoyed, but because they want to have the ad with us, because it's generating income for them. However, because of the disturbances that they're receiving in their day-to-day operations from these visits from the Ministry of State Security, they had to just pull the ad.
In Australia, Chinese government officials have waged an extraordinary campaign to hurt the Vision Times. Last year, after initially being accepted as a sponsor for the Chinese New Year festival, the Vision Times was suddenly told by the Georges River Council its sponsorship was cancelled.
We were slightly suspicious because we thought there could have been some pressures coming from the Chinese consulate.
Four Corners has obtained an email sent by the Chinese consulate to the Georges River Council, warning it to blackban Marie Ma's paper.
We have noticed that a politically anti-China media named Vision China Times has been listed as an event supporter. We have attached great importance to our cooperation with the Georges River City Council and hope there will be no change to the policy of Georges River City Council on supporting the development of Australia-China relationship.
Why would the Chinese consulate be so upset about your newspaper sponsoring this local government event?
Because we are an independent paper, it's a newspaper that they cannot control. And the Chinese consulate do not like any media outlets that they cannot have some sort of control over.
Worried her paper would again be blocked from participating in another New Year's festival, Marie Ma took her concerns directly to the Georges River Council.
There has been some controversy around whether or not to approve our sponsorship this year. And there has also been an FOI lodged to look into circumstances surrounding the sudden cancellation of our sponsorship last year. Per the cancellation letter, the reason was due to council wanting to stay with existing media partners. However, since then, we have strong reasons to believe the real reason was due to interference from a foreign government. We are shocked and would like to seek a direct answer from the council whether that was the case.
Marie Ma's demand to know if the Chinese government was interfering in the affairs of the council sparked a furious debate between councillors.
I keep asking myself, and I can't find an answer as to, why was the decision made not to accept Vision China Times sponsorship when they clearly comply with our sponsorship policy?
Let me ask a question for you.
No. So, putting aside perhaps potentially the most galling of claims is that there's potentially alleged foreign government, influence.
But these assertions are based on no facts at all. And Councillor Gracchus is really overstepping the mark on this. And I suggest you get your facts right, because once again, you're wrong.
We will soon find out, I suppose, if there's any communication between foreign government and our council, but I suppose that we'll find that out.
Mr Mayor, the Acting Director has advised me that we did receive an email from the Consul General, not last year, Councillor Hindi, it was in January this year, and that email requested Council's consideration of not accepting the sponsorship due to the Vision China Times being considered to be politically anti-China. The information was relayed to the MEAC members at the time.
Confidential council documents obtained by Four Corners reveal Chinese government officials pressuring the council to blackban the Vision Times, even after Marie Ma questioned the council about Beijing's interference.
This morning I had a call from Mr Tony Wong, who works for the Chinese consul, to remind us that he would like to keep a friendly relationship between China and New South Wales. He wanted to make sure that there were no embarrassing situations this year and reiterate their position involving anti-China groups.
Mr. Tony Wong from the Chinese consulate phoned to remind Council of the delicate issues around this anti-Chinese group.
When the council refused to extend its ban on Marie Ma's newspaper, the Chinese consulate called again.
I received a call from the office of the Chinese Consul General. The Chinese Consul General was disappointed that Georges River Council would include anti-Chinese political groups in the Lunar New Year event. As a consequence, the Chinese Consul General will not attend the event.
Are you anti-China?
No, we actually love China, and that's the reason we are actually running this media outlet. Because we love China, we want the Chinese people here to actually know about the real news in China, and also the actual views and real views of the Australian government here.
There are several authoritarian states who are involved in foreign influence across the globe, but in Australia, the Chinese Communist Party is probably the most active, and China is seeking to influence our elites, particularly our political and business elites, in order to achieve their strategic objectives.
While the Chinese government threatens those who don't toe the party line, those who do are rewarded. Much of Australia's Chinese language media market is heavily influenced by the Chinese government, thanks in no small part to this man, Melbourne millionaire Tommy Zhang. Zhang is a media mogul, financing movies, mixing with celebrities, and golfing with politicians. Zhang owns Chinese language media outlets across Australia and the world.
Tommy Zhang is a very important media proprietor in Australia. He controls, he owns most of the Chinese language radio platforms in Australia, in most capital cities. He's got other business interests, including in Australia and China and globally. So he's a really important figure in Chinese media.
Tommy Zhang is running an international network of radio stations which are running state-run Chinese propaganda into different countries around the world.
Zhang's rise has been propelled by the Chinese government. He's a delegate to the China People's Political Consultative Conference, a platform of the Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which engages in lobbying and influence work for Beijing. In 2009, Zhang formed an Australian media joint venture, Lu1S0sII, with the company controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
Essentially, Chinese language media platforms in Australia have been co-opted largely by the Chinese Communist Party. They've been incentivised. In some cases, they've been bought or entered into various licence arrangements and agreements. And on the other end of the spectrum, publishers or independent voices who are prepared to have different views have been intimidated. Their financial revenues have been squeezed. Advertisers have been threatened. So really, we're talking about a full ecosystem of incentives and disincentives which dry up the space for independent voices and reward people who are prepared to toe the line from Beijing.
A dinner party at a restaurant in suburban Melbourne, where the guest of honour is radio host Xiao Lu. Xiao Lu was once a fixture on Tommy Zhang's Melbourne radio station 3CW, but is now off the airwaves. Xiao Lu is too scared to be interviewed by Four Corners to say why he's been taken off air. But his friend Dr. Lu says Xiao Lu's Melbourne Talkback program offended the Chinese government.
I think he knew clearly he was monitored. he was somebody watching him. Yeah, I think he knew that very well.
And how did that make him feel?
Make him put some restraints to himself. So when he choose topics, when he takes calls from the listeners, may be careful.
Four Corners has obtained directives to Lu from 3CW management, telling him not to let talkback callers say anything bad about the Chinese government, including President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Infrastructure Program or the constitutional change making Xi president for life.
Avoid discussing the change of constitution, as the One Belt, One Road summit has begun, has to be positive.
Be careful with the program. Try to stick to the topic.
In July, Lu was told by 3CW his program needed to change. Tommy Jiang then called Lu, chastising him for allowing talkback callers to criticise the Chinese Communist Party.
在这样做下，我不光是墨尔本的合作，我其他的合作都会有问题。你呢自己也会有问题，因为这个太过分了。你任意让他们这个在空中骂中国、骂共产党，而且语言那么恶毒，这哪成啊？
Lu's program was cancelled.
I was very surprised. The program was stopped, but I was very surprised. Because it's very popular, I got so many listeners, so many years, and the program Lu is so helpful to the community.
Well, the thing about the Chinese Communist Party is that they're constantly worried about their legitimacy. Constantly. And as a result of that type of concern, one believes that the only way to maintain stability in one's society is not only through police and political action, but also by having people, if they don't agree with you, at least be silent.
Tommy Jiang's wealth and business ventures have allowed him access to the good and great of Australian politics. In 2013, Tommy Jiang hosted a Chinese Business Awards night, where then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd was a special guest, and guests donated $260,000 to the ALP. Jiang has organised fundraisers for both major parties, with few questions asked.
When it comes to donations, particularly, politicians should be naturally circumspect about who they receive donations from, particularly if donors have connections to overseas, and particularly to foreign governments who are seeking to influence our political processes.
As well as his media interests, Tommy Jiang is overseeing the $100 million development of the Twin Creeks golf course in outer Sydney. His fellow director in this venture is casino industry tycoon Jack Lam, seen here at a golf club event. Jack Lam is a member of 3 organisations involved in the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Overseas Influence Network. He's also a fugitive. In 2017, Lam was charged with paying a $1.3 million bribe to senior immigration officials in the Philippines.
Ipinag-utos na ni Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte ang pag-aresto sa big-time online gambling operator na si Jack Lam dahil umano sa panunuhol at economic sabotage.
After the Department of Justice issued a lookout order against a gambling tycoon, Gin Loc Yam, or also known as Jack Lam, the Bureau of Immigration gave out pictures of Jack Lam to all 700 immigration officers in the entire country.
After fleeing the Philippines, Jack Lam visited his Australian golf club, Twin Creeks. It was there in February 2018 that Lam and fellow director Tommy Jiang hosted a golf day. Their special guest was Tony Abbott, who as Prime Minister had been warned by ASIO about foreign influence and donations. A fortnight later, Tony Abbott was again hosted by Twin Creeks, this time for an event supporting his local Liberal Party branch. Mr Abbott told the fundraiser he was no friend of communism, while the Liberal Party later declared $40,000 in services donated by Twin Creeks.
Look, if I was a politician, I wouldn't be taking money from somebody who is involved in a foreign propaganda outlet, no.
Why not?
Because there's at least the risk of the perception of conflict of interest of being tainted.
John Garneau was one of Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's senior advisors on China.
There's no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party has sought to use all sorts of vehicles to have non-transparent mechanisms, means of influencing politics in Australia and elsewhere.
In Australia, it is clear that the Chinese Communist Party is working to covertly interfere with our media, our universities, and also influence our political processes and public debates.
Andrew Hastie chaired the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security that spent months analysing how the Chinese government was interfering in Australian politics. He helped push through sweeping new laws banning foreign interference.
We've had multiple briefings at the top secret level from ASIO and other agencies that foreign interference is being conducted in Australia at an unprecedented level. We heard from the head of ASIO say that on the public record, espionage and foreign interference is being conducted in Australia on unprecedented levels, and we have to take that seriously.
We consider that the potential for foreign interference and foreign influence in our democratic system to be of such a high level of concern that it motivated us to totally redraft the laws so that we had the full suite of powers to police these real concerns.
Australia's new counter-foreign interference regime was introduced after Four Corners exposed the activities of this man, billionaire property developer Huang Xiangmo.
ABC Four Corners, we'd like to ask you about your relationship to the Chinese Communist Party.
我们就想问你一些问题，我们就想问你的关系跟中国的共产党。
我没有任何关系。
Is the Chinese Communist Party directing you to donate to Australian political parties?
No.
没有。
Huang arrived in Australia from China in 2011. His Australian companies have donated millions of dollars to charity and political parties.
Let's not pussyfoot around here. Huang Xiangmo was a seriously influential person in the Sydney Chinese community and also in the broader Australian political makeup. This is one of, if not the largest political donor to the major parties.
In 2015, spy agency ASIO warned Labor and the Liberals that Huang posed a risk of engaging in foreign interference on behalf of Beijing.
There is a lot of well-documented evidence, to use your word, of Huang Xiangmo's umbilical connection to political organisations which were guided, if not controlled, by Beijing. He was the president of the most important United Front work department platform in Australia.
Huang's donations gave him extraordinary access to senior politicians.
How about we thank Mr. Huang with 3 cheers for his generosity today. Hip hip, hip hip, hip hip.
Well, it tells us how cheap our political systems are. I mean, it's extraordinary that nobody did any due diligence, any serious background checks for so long. In fact, it was a case also, people weren't even reading the newspaper. So political systems and parties just took what they could for as long as they could get away with it. And the danger was that they were becoming financially dependent on a foreign political system. And that is a precarious place to be.
Within Labor, then Senator Sam Dastyari was among Huang's closest political allies. His dealings with Huang forced him to resign.
I've been very upfront and honest. I was too close to the big donors like Huang Zhangmo. I paid a very, very high price for that. I resigned from Parliament because that was the most appropriate thing that I could do.
My prediction is that there will be a lot more that comes out in relation to Mr Dastyari. He's a shady figure. If he's a double agent, he shouldn't be in the Australian Senate. And Mr Shorten ultimately needs to show the leadership to sack Mr Dastyari and to send a very clear message to the rest of the Labor Party who's involved in this sort of behaviour that it's unacceptable.
The story of Huang's connections does not end there. We have obtained new information about how Huang sought and gained access to politicians, including senior ministers. This information's remained hidden from public view for years, despite the intense scrutiny on Huang. The revelations come as insiders from both major parties tell Four Corners privately they're concerned the full and continuing story of Beijing's meddling in Australia is not being told. In late 2014, while trying to expedite citizenship for his family, Huang sought a political favour, a private citizenship ceremony.
So this was one of the strangest interactions that I ever had with Huang Zhangmo. And that was that his family and his children had been approved already to become Australian citizens. But it's actually a long process. He wanted the ceremony brought forward for his wife and children.
Dastyari passed on Huang's request to then Immigration Minister Peter Dutton.
I put a request in on New Year's Eve, because I work throughout the year, on New Year's Eve, end of 2014, start of 2015. 2 weeks later, in mid-January, it was approved by Peter Dutton. That blew me away. It blew me away because ministers take months for these kinds of approvals.
Peter Dutton might say, well, the only reason Peter Dutton approved this was because Sam Dastyari asked me in writing. I took him on good faith. Is that not a fair response?
I am not the Minister for Immigration. Right? I mean, if Peter Dutton's explanation for doing things is because Sam Dastyari asked him to do it, that is ludicrous.
Huang's family's private citizenship ceremony was held inside Dastyari's office.
Peter Dutton has called you a double agent. Isn't this a bit of payback from you?
Look, what Peter Dutton wants to call me is a matter for Peter Dutton. I mean, look, politics, there's a lot of rough and tumble in politics, and I've punched and I've taken punches, and I accept that's part of the territory.
By the time Huang moved to apply for his own citizenship in late 2015, he was being investigated by ASIO, which was worried about his access to Australian politicians.
He did have a lot of access. He was photographed with a lot of senior figures. So undeniably, he had a lot of influence. And, you can make the connection between his donations and that influence.
Huang turned to another political contact, Santo Santoro, a former minister in the Howard government turned lobbyist. Santoro's business involves providing access to politicians. Four Corners has obtained a confidential record of a meeting in which he boasted about his direct line to Peter Dutton.
One of my best friends is Peter Dutton. He is the most honest politician you'll ever meet. But he tries to be helpful. Like if there is, a capability or a critical mass of investment that comes into Australia, that can come into Australia, he will try to help.
Santoro tells his clients he can help with attempts to expedite immigration applications.
There is nobody in Australia who's got a place for me to help you with this particular part of the project. Nobody. I can go to somebody in the minister's office and say, can you have a close look at this?
Santoro charges at least $20,000 to access Peter Dutton's office.
If I'm going to be doing the work, I'm going to go to Canberra, with a copy of the visa application and hand it over to somebody and say, can you help? No, I want to get paid and paid up front.
In 2016, as Huang became increasingly anxious about securing his own citizenship, he put Santoro on a retainer. Santoro delivered, arranging a lunch between Huang, Peter Dutton and the minister's senior staffer in a private room at Master Ken's restaurant in Sydney's Chinatown. This gave Huang direct access to the man most citizenship applicants could only dream of meeting to push their case. Santoro told Four Corners his work with Huang was limited to providing introductory services. Both Huang and Santoro deny their arrangement was aimed at getting Huang citizenship. Peter Dutton confirmed the lunch, but denied he'd assisted Huang.
Australia has shut the door on one of China's wealthiest and most prominent businessmen.
Huang's attempt to get a passport failed based on advice from ASIO. He posed a risk of foreign interference, and last November he was banned from re-entering Australia.
They're sensitive matters, and the government has always acted consistent with the advice that we've received, and that's what has happened on this occasion.
Well, we've heard from our security agencies that espionage and foreign interference in Australia is being conducted at unprecedented levels. So Mr. Huang being denied citizenship is very significant because it shows that this government is prepared to use the powers at their disposal to protect our sovereignty and our democracy.
Given that there are very strict new laws requiring relationships to be transparent, as we move into the future, if people were acting, trying to influence a government outcome, and they were doing that being paid for or engaged by a foreign principal, then as of the institution of this legislation, i.e. now, that relationship would have to be documented and knowable to the Australian people.
The Chinese Communist Party wants to stay in power.
In New Zealand, academic Anne-Marie Brady has been investigating how the Chinese Communist Party interferes in political systems overseas.
In 2017, she released an explosive report exposing allegations of Chinese government interference in New Zealand politics.
It's some have described as like a bombshell, and it's had the significance gone well beyond New Zealand. In my paper, I found that there had been there was substantial donations, particularly to the New Zealand National Party, but Labour also, and the Maori Party, of figures who I were able to identify as being very closely affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party's United Front work activities.
I have known Anne-Marie Brady for nearly 30 years now, and I worked with her closely on her PhD thesis. I think she's a very calm and collected academic, very focused, very stern and serious academic. She's principled and outspoken, and that in any environment can cause people to feel irritated.
The day before she was due to give evidence before Australia's Parliament about her report, her home and office were burgled.
There were many indications that from the start, from what was taken and what was left behind, that make it look like it was not your normal burglary. For example, targeting of a broken laptop of no value to anybody, unless you want to know who my contacts are or get other evidence of my laptop. Taking a burner phone that I'd last taken to China, but not taking cash, not taking other valuables that are of great resaleable value. That's unusual.
We were very disturbed. We had an esteemed academic from New Zealand telling us that she'd had her home broken into, her laptops taken from her, and she was suggesting foreign interference. We took it very seriously.
Government sources have confirmed to Four Corners that intelligence assessments identified China's spy service, the Ministry of State Security, as the prime suspect behind the intimidation of Brady. Just after she was called before the Australian Parliament, Chinese intelligence agents interrogated her academic collaborators in China about her testimony, which had been published on the parliamentary Hansard record.
There was a visit to the university who had hosted me in November 2017, also from Ministry of State Security, and very upset that I'd spoken into Hansard about that evidence. So all these kind of factors told me that I was of interest to the Ministry of State Security in China.
China's spy agency has been active in Australia as well. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's senior China advisor, John Garneau, is a former journalist who spent 6 years in Beijing. In 2016, Malcolm Turnbull directed Garneau to partner with spy agency ASIO on a top-secret report about the Chinese government's interference campaign in Australia.
You did a classified report with ASIO for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet about Beijing's interference in this country. What did that report find?
I have been involved in a classified project, and I clearly can't talk about the contents of that project.
Garneau's work with ASIO appears to have been of intense interest to Beijing. In early 2017, China expert and Sydney academic Dr. Feng Chongyi came to the attention of the Chinese authorities over his friendship with Garneau. On a trip to China, Dr. Feng was detained for several days and interrogated by Chinese intelligence officials. For the first time, he's willing to reveal the details of that interrogation.
I would say they focus very much on John Garneau.
John Garneau.
John Garneau, I happen to be a good friend of him, and actually we spent a whole day, more than 1 day on him in every detail, while we met, what kind of things we talk about, what kind of contact we have together, and all that in every detail.
What did they want to know about John Garneau?
He knows his position in government, what exactly he's doing, what he was doing in China, and what he has been doing back in Australia. It's in very detail whatsoever.
Did they know John Garneau was working for Malcolm Turnbull?
Yes, they knew a lot about him. Actually, during the interrogation, they did not hide their anger with him.
Look, leaving aside the work that I was doing, the fact that an Australian resident who's an important part of the national debate here could be detained without any legal process in a hotel room in Guangzhou for the best part of a week shows a certain disregard or disparagement for our ability to defend the rights of our own citizens and our residents.
And question about you, the Prime Minister's advisor.
Well, that seems to add an extra layer of contempt.
In March last year, another of Garneau's Chinese contacts was quizzed. Australian writer Yang Hengjun was en route to a meeting with Garneau in central Sydney when he was unexpectedly diverted.
We're going to meet at 4. He arrived closer to 5. And he apologised because he said he'd been intercepted on the way. He'd been called by a Chinese official.
A Chinese official?
A Chinese official, yeah. He was asked about me, what was the nature of our relationship, what was I doing, what was I working on.
After this, Garneau warned Yang not to travel to China. Garneau was worried that Yang might be arrested due to their relationship, and felt Yang was especially exposed as a former security service employee who'd become a critic of the Communist Party.
This is the most powerful story of all, is the insider who came to know too much and tells his story outside. Certainly in my experience, my most important teachers and sources were insiders in the Chinese system who were prepared to talk about it and explain how it works.
Young ignored Garneau's advice and in January flew to China with his wife Xiao Liang and her 14-year-old daughter. When Young arrived, Chinese officials were waiting.
然后我跟女儿我们俩过关的时候，刚过了关，我可能有10来个人吧，男男女女挂着证件，然后就把我们拦下来了。拦下来，他就说看我女儿的护照，然后就说我女儿的护照，哎，好像你这个入境时间啊，过去的入境时间有些问题。都是这种彪形大汉，带着那个证件，还举着这个他们有个小型的这个摄像机，一路带着，然后出来之后，我们3个人被分开了，我跟女儿一辆车，她自己一辆车，我们就被分开，自那以后再也没见过。
Now in Shanghai, Xiao Liang is still waiting for news of her husband. She hasn't been allowed to see him since he's been detained. Until now, she's never spoken publicly. It is extremely perilous to do so in China.
我的亲人，我们每天都在一起的一个亲人，忽然之间消失了，然后我完全不知道他是不是健康，甚至他是不是还活着，我完全不知道，就是连一个口信儿都没有，然后也没有办法去帮他在法律的这个轨道上来往前推进，所以我现在真的是完全就很崩溃的状态。我只希望他能平安回来。
Young has not been formally charged, but he's been accused of endangering state security. He's been detained for 3 months and has not been allowed to see a lawyer.
时间越长越难受，主要是见不到他，就哪怕如果律师能看到他，确认他安全，我也能心安一点。现在就完全没办法。
I think it's quite standard for people in his situations to be kept awake for days and nights on end as a way of breaking down mental defences and inducing really what can be a form of madness for some people. It's normal to be fed disinformation about what your friends are saying, what foreign governments are saying, what your own government is saying. So they will be potentially trying to destabilise Dr. Young, and that I find that a very disturbing idea.
Xiao Liang says she has been banned from leaving China. She's calling on the Australian government to fight harder for the release of her husband.
我觉得最基本，这个澳大利亚政府的官员应该去关注他国的国民在另外一个国家的，至少是最基本的人权的一些状况的一些去关怀吧。但是我觉得现在，我说实话，我挺失望的。我希望这个澳大利亚政府能至少有一些最基本的关怀。
Mr. Young is an Australian citizen. He enjoys the rights and responsibilities of Australian citizenship. And so his detention, in a sense, is a detention of us all. We're all Australian citizens. How could we guarantee that we wouldn't be detained if we went to China?
I would like to see the government do more. I'd like to see the government do more behind closed doors, and I'd like to, at the very least, see some really strong statements about what this is and why the importance of Young to the Australian community, Australian society.
Detaining Yang in China has silenced him and his blog. Whether that was the aim is unclear. But the Chinese Communist Party is running a campaign here in Australia to silence others, seemingly unperturbed by new laws aimed at stopping this very behaviour.